This is Paul, and in 2023, at the age of 62, Paul collapsed onto the floor of his home, where he lives alone. Paul had had a stroke and was losing his brain cells, or neurons, at an estimated rate of 1.9 million per minute. He was losing his brain's white matter pathways, which are the long strands that connect the whole brain together, at an approximate rate of 12 kilometers per minute as he lay there. Paul experienced total paralysis of the right-hand side of his body. But with his working left arm, he managed to reach out and pick up some shoes, throw them out a window, and alert a neighbour that something was not right. The neighbour broke into Paul's home and took him to hospital. And on this occasion, Paul was very lucky. When Paul volunteered to take part in my research 4 weeks after the stroke, his right arm and leg were still paralysed. He was engaging well with physiotherapy, but he was just finding that his commands to move were not being translated into any actual movement. We can think about the brain's structure and function as a bit like hardware and software, where the hardware is the physical cells. We've got grey matter, which is a jelly-like substance comprised of our cell bodies. We've also got white matter, which is a white, fatty, myelinated substance, which comprises fibers that connect all the parts of the brain together over long distances. But we also have something like software, which is the usual patterns of activity flow through the system. Learned programs, things like riding a bicycle, playing piano, or even just getting dressed in the morning. And we know now that function, or the way we use our brain, can influence structure. So, for example, if you learn a new skill, let's say you decide to learn how to juggle. You experience what we call activity-dependent neuroplasticity, which is where previously lesser used pathways in the brain adapt to accommodate new traffic in those pathways. You can think of this like a grassy path through the countryside, which gradually over time becomes wider and smoother to accommodate new footfall, and eventually becomes a well-trodden path. And in the brain, we can actually visualize these small structural changes as a result of learning using a type of MRI scan which is sensitive to the diffusion of water molecules. And using this, we can create highly detailed images of the brain's white matter pathways. The white matter pathways are like the highways that connect all the parts of the brain together, the highways of our information flow. They're coated with white fatty myelin, which is a bit like insulation on the wires. And they become more heavily insulated the more they're used. And the better insulated they are with the white fatty myelin, the more efficiently they can carry their messages from one part of the brain to another. So we know that function, or the way we use our brain, can influence the structure. So in some ways, you could say that the software running through it can actually have an influence on the hardware. But if the hardware is damaged, for example by a stroke, the consequences for the individual can be severe and life-changing. For the past 15 years, I have been performing research into brain structure-function relationships and trying to think creatively about ways to apply the theory and knowledge about what is going on in the damaged brain to come up with new methods of rehabilitation, new ways to reprogram the brain to adapt to new patterns, especially after brain damage. Because the damaged part of the brain is not coming back. There is no regrowth or regeneration. There is only adaptation to creating new pathways well-trodden. And at the heart of the approach used in my research is something called neurofeedback, which exploits one of the most fundamental processes in the human brain, and that is the ability to learn and adapt passively by processing an incoming stream of feedback from the senses. Using neurofeedback, a person can learn to change processes that are ongoing in the brain itself. It's like providing a window into an otherwise hidden mental process. So in my lab, we hack this natural mental process. If you think about riding a bicycle, for example, this is not explicit. You don't read a manual about how to ride a bicycle. You learn implicitly by processing feedback from incoming stream of feedback from your senses. So when Paul volunteered for my research 4 weeks after his stroke, we brought our equipment to his bedside. And one of the first things we did with him was stimulate his brain with magnetic pulses to see whether we could evoke a twitch in his paralyzed arm and hand. Because when you apply a magnetic pulse over the part of the brain that controls the arm and hand over exactly the right spot, you should get a little twitch in the relevant muscles, if this part is connected all the way down the spinal cord to the arm and hand. In Paul's case, and actually in 90% of such cases, a twitch occurred, which told us that the signals from his brain were in fact reaching his muscles. And then this fact was confirmed when we saw his MRI scan, and we could see visually that the pathways connecting the right part of his brain to his spinal cord and onto his muscles was in fact intact. With the neurofeedback, he learned over a period of a few weeks how to make the responses in his muscle bigger over time by generating patterns of brain activity associated with imagined movement. And he particularly enjoyed this task in the early phase of his rehabilitation, when he couldn't really do much with the arm and hand, because this was something that he could do outside of physiotherapy, because it required only the imagination of movement. When we followed up with Paul 6 months later, he was very pleased with his recovery, and he told me that he could now walk independently down to the pub and practice his upper limb movement by raising a pint. My team are still investigating whether this type of technology could or even should ever make it into standard stroke care in hospitals in the future. But where its use may be particularly valuable is in the increasingly common cases of functional neurological disorders, where there is an intriguing mismatch between brain structure and function. In a functional neurological disorder, the software has experienced a fault, but the hardware remains intact. There is no brain damage or spinal cord damage or nervous system damage. There's no disease or virus. But the system cannot communicate in the way that it used to. My team are currently working on ways to rehabilitate people with functional neurological disorders, applying the concepts of neurofeedback, rewarding desirable patterns of brain activity to try to reprogram normal function in the system. And now we are working on scaling down our technology so that someday a person with a structural or a functional brain disorder could take their rehabilitation into their own hands and into their own homes. From the earliest attempts to interact with and record from the human brain using magnets and electricity, we've come a very long way to where we are today, where I can send this hairband home with a stroke patient and they can use this to play a game where the avatar on screen is driven by brain activity associated with mental practice of a movement that they cannot perform themselves well physically. As it currently stands, according to the World Stroke Organization, 1 in 4 of us in this room will experience a stroke in our lifetime. The vast majority of those, about 75%, will occur in the over 65 age category. And with the current trend towards an aging population, by 2050 there will be more people in that age category than in any other. But the good news is that in recent decades, remarkable progress has been made to maximize your chances of surviving a stroke. And survival is good. We want to survive. But the problem then is that we are left with more survivors who have to live the rest of their lives with disability. In 2050, I will be 62, the same age as Paul was when he had his stroke. And I have hope that the outcomes for people with brain disorders will be remarkably better in 2050 than is currently the case today. And that is why I'm focusing my research into technological advances to level up recovery, to ensure that more people can live independently with a better quality of life into old age, even after sustaining damage to your most vital organ. Thank you.